Good evening, and welcome back to Sleep and Seek. Tonight's story is about a god who already knew how his own story would end, who had seen his fate written into the very fabric of existence long before the final chapter arrived, and who chose, with complete and deliberate awareness, to keep going anyway. Get comfortable, let your eyes close if they want to, and let's spend the next while in the company of the most complex, most contradictory, and most quietly human figure in all of Norse mythology. Tonight we are talking about Odin. Before we go any further, it is worth saying plainly that Odin is not the kind of god that most people raised on simpler mythological frameworks are used to thinking about. He is not good, exactly, in any straightforward moral sense. He is not reliably kind. He deceives when deception serves him, abandons people who trusted him when the calculation shifts, and pursues his own purposes with a focus that sometimes looks indistinguishable from cruelty. He is also, and this is the thing that makes him so persistently fascinating across 1,000 years of retelling, genuinely wise, genuinely curious, genuinely capable of sacrifice, so painful and so complete that even his worst qualities cannot fully diminish it. He is, in short, a god shaped very much like a person, complicated and contradictory and driven, in the end, by the same fundamental fear that drives a great deal of human behavior as well, the fear of not knowing enough. Let us start at the beginning, or as close to a beginning as Odin actually has, since the old sources are not always in agreement about his exact origins. The Norse myths that survive to us come primarily from two collections written down in Iceland in the 13th century, a period already well into the Christian era, which means they were recorded by writers who knew Christianity well and inevitably filtered these older stories through that lens. The Poetic Edda is the older collection, a gathering of Norse mythological and heroic poetry of remarkable age and depth. The Prose Edda was compiled by an Icelandic scholar named Snorri Sturluson, who was himself Christian, but recognized the old myths as a body of knowledge worth preserving, and wrote them down with both genuine care and the occasional interpretive gloss that reflects his own era more than the original beliefs. These are the sources we are drawing from tonight, imperfect but irreplaceable, the closest thing we have to a direct window into how the Norse actually understood their gods. Odin is described across these sources as the Allfather, a title that carries more weight than it might initially seem. He is the father, literally or figuratively, of most of the other gods in the Norse pantheon. He rules from Asgard, the realm of the gods, seated on a great throne called Hlidskjalf, from which, the old poems say, he could look out across all 9 of the worlds that make up the Norse universe, and see everything that was happening in all of them at once. He is described as an older man, bearded and grey, but not frail, powerful in ways that go well beyond physical strength, carrying a spear called Gungnir that was said to never miss its mark, traveling always in a wide-brimmed hat and a long cloak that disguised him when he moved through the world of humans, which he did often, and for reasons he rarely explained fully to anyone. His companions are worth describing too, because they tell you something important about who he actually is, not a god of raw, uncomplicated power, but a god of knowledge, information, and the relentless, almost desperate gathering of understanding from every source available. 2 ravens, named Huginn and Muninn, which translate from Old Norse as thought and memory, left his shoulders every morning at dawn and flew out across all 9 worlds, observing everything, speaking to no one, and returned each evening to whisper into his ears everything they had seen. He also kept 2 wolves, Geri and Freki, at his side, whose names translate roughly as greedy and ravenous, an interesting choice of companion for a god whose own hunger was for something entirely different from food. And he rode an 8-legged horse called Sleipnir, who could travel between worlds, cross any terrain, and outpace anything else that existed, a horse remarkable enough that its own origin story is one of the stranger and more darkly comic episodes in the entire mythology. What drove Odin, across every story the old sources tell about him, was knowledge, specifically the kind of knowledge that was hard to get, the kind that cost something real. He was not a god who accepted the limits of what he already knew. He pushed constantly against those limits, and the pushing was genuinely painful, not metaphorically, but literally, physically, in ways the old poems describe with a directness that is still arresting to read. The first great sacrifice the stories tell is the loss of his eye. Beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, the vast world tree whose branches and roots connected all 9 of the Norse worlds together, sat a well, tended by a being called Mimir, a figure of immense wisdom, whose name is connected to an Old Norse root meaning memory or thought. The water of this well was not ordinary water. It contained knowledge, specifically, the accumulated wisdom of everything that had ever happened across all of existence, stored in that dark, deep water in a way that could be accessed by anyone who drank from it. Mimir drank from it daily, and his wisdom was, accordingly, without parallel. Odin came to this well, wanting what it held. He asked Mimir for a drink. Mimir's price was exactly what you might expect from a figure who understood value. He demanded one of Odin's eyes. Not a promise, not a service, not a future favor. An eye, right now, removed and dropped into the well as the cost of access to what the water contained. Odin agreed. He tore out his own eye and dropped it into the dark water, and then he drank, and the knowledge the well contained opened up to him, vast and deep and expensive in a way that could not be unfelt. What makes this sacrifice remarkable, beyond the simple physical fact of it, is that Odin gained something genuinely paradoxical from what looked like a loss. He gave up one eye, one half of the ordinary sight that anyone possesses, and in exchange received something far beyond ordinary sight, a depth of understanding about the world and how it worked and what it held that no amount of simply looking with 2 functional eyes could ever have provided. He became, from that moment, visibly and permanently marked by what he had chosen. The empty socket was not hidden or mourned. It was carried openly, a constant, visible reminder that wisdom is not free, that understanding of the real and deep kind always cost something, and that the God who ruled all 9 worlds had decided, with full awareness, that the cost was worth paying. The second sacrifice is harder to describe, because it pushes into territory that does not have an easy parallel anywhere else in mythology. The runes, in Norse belief, were not simply a writing system, though they did function as one. They were understood as symbols of the deepest forces in the cosmos, each rune encoding not just a sound or a letter, but a specific, real power that existed in the world. And to know a rune was to know the force it represented, and knowing the force meant being able to work with it in ways that went far beyond anything ordinary knowledge could provide. The runes were not invented or designed by any of the gods. They existed, the old beliefs held, in the Well of Erd, the Well of Fate, tended by the Norns, the 3 great weavers of destiny who sat at Yggdrasil's roots and spun the threads of every life that had ever been or would ever be lived. Odin wanted the runes, and the runes, according to the old poem that describes this story most directly, would not reveal themselves to anyone who had not proved themselves worthy of the knowing, which meant willing to pay a price that the runes themselves would recognize as real. Odin's solution was one of the most extraordinary acts of self-imposed suffering in any mythology anywhere. He hanged himself from a branch of Yggdrasil, the World Tree, piercing himself with his own spear, Gungnir, as he hung there, in deliberate mimicry of the sacrifices that were made to him in the world below. He commanded the other gods to give him no help whatsoever, not food, not water, not assistance of any kind, and he hung there, balanced on the edge between living and dying, staring downward into the dark water where the runes lived, for 9 days and 9 nights. The old poem, the Havamal, describes this in Odin's own voice, and the description has a quality of rawness to it that is unusual even by the standards of Norse mythology, which is generally not squeamish about pain. He describes himself as given to Odin, myself to myself, a phrase that scholars have unpacked in many directions, but which most interpret as meaning that this was a sacrifice in the truest ritual sense, a gift of the self, offered to the self, the highest possible sacrifice, precisely because the one who gave and the one who received were the same being. He hung there through 9 days and nights without food or water, dying and not dying, until at the end of the 9th night something shifted in the dark water below him. The runes, having accepted his offering, finally revealed their shapes. He seized them with a cry, the old poem says, and fell from the tree. And from that moment, the runes and everything they encoded were his, a body of knowledge so dense and so far-reaching that it took 143 separate verses of the Havamal to even begin cataloguing what he had learned from them. There is something worth sitting with here, something that goes beyond the specific mythology and into the question of why a story like this has been told and retold for over 1,000 years. Odin did not hang from that tree because someone forced him to. He chose it. He chose 9 days of what the old sources clearly understood as a form of dying, suspended between worlds, in order to reach something he believed was worth that cost. The Norse worldview that shaped this story understood sacrifice as the real measure of value, not what a thing cost someone else, but what you yourself were willing to give up to have it. And what Odin was willing to give up was, not once, but repeatedly and with full awareness, his own comfort, his own physical wholeness, his own safety, in exchange for understanding. It also, and this is worth noting plainly, set a pattern. Because Odin's sacrifices did not end with the runes or the eye. The knowledge he accumulated through these and many other costly acts kept pointing him toward a truth he would spend the rest of his existence trying to find a way around, and finally, having failed to find one, trying to face with whatever wisdom he had managed to gather. But before we arrive at that truth, it is worth spending time with the broader shape of how Odin moved through the world and what he was actually building, because the sacrifices of the eye and the 9 days on Yggdrasil were not isolated episodes. They were the most dramatic expressions of a character that showed itself consistently across every story the old sources tell about him, always reaching further, always paying more, always driven by something that looked, from the outside, less like the behavior of a ruling god, and more like the behavior of someone who genuinely could not stop. Take the story of the Mead of Poetry, which is one of the stranger and more revealing tales in all of Norse mythology, because it shows a side of Odin that the sacrifices at the well and on the tree only hint at. Alongside his willingness to suffer for knowledge was an equally strong willingness to deceive and scheme for it when suffering alone was not enough. The Mead of Poetry came into existence through an ancient peace treaty. At the end of a long war between two families of gods, the Aesir and the Vanir, the two sides had sealed their peace in an unusual way, every god and goddess from both groups spitting into a great vessel, their combined essence mixing into something new. From that mixed substance arose a being called Kvasir, who carried within him the wisdom of every deity who had contributed to his making, a being so wise that there was genuinely no question he could not answer. He wandered the world, sharing his knowledge freely, and his existence was, for a while, one of the more purely good things in the Norse mythological universe. Then 2 dwarves, named Fjalar and Galar, killed him, caught his blood, mixed it with honey, and sealed it into 3 vessels. The mead brewed from Kvasir's blood carried his gift with it, and whoever drank it received the new ability to speak with the wisdom of a poet and the clarity of a prophet. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of knowledge Odin spent his existence pursuing, distilled into a form that could be taken, rather than simply earned through sacrifice. The mead passed through several hands, eventually ending up in the possession of a giant named Suttungr, who stored it in a cave deep within a mountain called Hnitbjörg, guarded by his daughter Gunnlod, who sat with it in the mountain's heart and watched over it without rest. Odin's response to learning that this existed was immediate and characteristically indirect. He did not attack the mountain. He did not demand the mead. He arrived, disguised, in the area where the giant Suttungr's brother, Baugi, lived, presenting himself as a wandering laborer called Bolverk, a name meaning something close to evildoer or worker of harm, a detail that tells you exactly how honest Odin was being about his intentions, even in his choice of alias. He worked for an entire summer doing the labor of 9 men, using his own magic to sharpen the scythes of Baugi's so efficiently that arguments broke out among them about whose was sharpest, arguments Odin manipulated until the workers were dead and Baugi needed exactly the kind of extraordinarily capable replacement laborer that had conveniently just arrived. His payment, when summer ended, was simply Baugi's help in getting to the mead. Baugi agreed, then tried and failed to betray him multiple times when Suttungr refused to share. Odin drilled through the mountain himself, transformed into a snake to slip through the hole, and spent 3 nights inside with Gunnlod, who had been set to guard the mead with absolute fidelity, and instead, whether through genuine feeling or through Odin's persuasion, or through some combination of the two that the old sources leave deliberately unclear, let him drink from all 3 vessels. He drank everything, all 3 containers, emptied completely. Then he transformed into an eagle, burst back out through the mountain, and flew for Asgard as fast as his wings would carry him. Suttungr also transformed into an eagle, in furious pursuit behind him. He made it back to Asgard just barely, spitting the mead into containers the other gods had prepared, though the old sources note with a kind of deadpan humor that some of the mead was lost in the undignified rush of the escape, spilled out carelessly, and that portion became the source of poetry for lesser poets, a gift Odin had not intended to make, and made only by accident at his most undignified moment. What this story adds to the picture of Odin is important. He was not only a god willing to suffer for knowledge, he was a god willing to lie, to manipulate, to spend an entire summer doing hard labor under a false name, to make promises he had no intention of honoring, all in the service of the same endless reaching for more. The name he gave himself, Bolverk, the evildoer, was honest in a way the alias was not. He knew what he was doing and chose it anyway, because the alternative, accepting that there was wisdom he could not access, was genuinely intolerable to him. This duality sits at the heart of almost every story about Odin. He is not a god you could trust in the ordinary, personal sense. He would give you victory in battle, and then, when the moment suited him, withdraw that favor without warning. He would form alliances he intended to break. He would appear in disguise among humans and involve himself in their lives in ways that served his purposes more than theirs. The old sources are surprisingly honest about this, and the Norse who worshipped him were apparently also honest about it, knowing they were dealing with a god who was brilliant and powerful and genuinely motivated by something beyond ordinary self-interest, but who was not safe in any comfortable sense. He was also, and this matters for understanding the full picture, genuinely connected to the world of the dead in ways that went beyond simply ruling over Valhalla. He could travel to the realm of the dead and speak with those who had already passed through it. He preserved the severed head of Mimir, keeping that wellspring of wisdom available beyond the death of its original owner. refusing to accept that death meant the end of what a being had known. He practiced forms of magic, particularly a shamanic tradition called Seder, that were considered in Norse culture specifically the province of women, a choice that the old sources acknowledge brought social stigma even from his fellow gods, and which he accepted as the price of access to a form of knowledge that was otherwise closed to him. He had roughly 170 different names, each reflecting a different facet of what he was: the Masked One, the Wanderer, the Father of Battle, the One who sees from the high seat, the Lord of the Gallows, each name a door into a different room of a personality too large and too contradictory to fit inside any single description. Let us spend a little time now on Valhalla, because it is one of the most famous features of Norse country, and also one of the most misunderstood, at least in the way popular culture tends to present it. Valhalla was not simply a paradise where brave warriors went after death to enjoy an endless feast. It was, from Odin's perspective, something far more purposeful than that, and understanding his purpose changes the entire shape of the institution. Odin knew Ragnarok was coming. He had known for as long as the prophecy had existed, which by the logic of the Norse mythological framework meant he had known for an immeasurably long time. And one of the things the prophecy told him was that on the day of Ragnarok, the forces arrayed against the gods would be enormous. The wolf Fenrir, the world serpent Jormungandr, the armies of the fire giants, Loki's own forces, everything that had been building in opposition to the order of Asgard across the entire span of existence. Against that, Odin needed an army. Valhalla was that army. The hall itself was vast, described in the old sources with a kind of staggering specificity that seems designed to make the scale feel real. 540 doors, each wide enough that 800 warriors could march through it side by side. A roof thatched with shields, spears for rafters. The most skilled and bravest warriors who died in battle across all the human world were gathered by the Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, those shield maidens who rode over battlefields, selecting who would be taken to Odin and who would go elsewhere. Once in Valhalla, these warriors, the Einherjar, trained every day, fighting each other with real weapons and real injuries, healing overnight to fight again the next morning, preparing with absolute seriousness for the battle that Odin knew was eventually coming. He feasted with them. He sat at the head of that enormous hall and ate and drank alongside men who had died bravely, men he had specifically chosen for exactly the qualities they would need when Ragnarok finally arrived. He kept 2 wolves fed with the meat from his own plate, eating nothing himself, sustained entirely on wine. Another detail the old sources include without particular comment, but which speaks to something deliberate: a god who sat at a feast but did not eat, watching, thinking, preparing, never quite fully at rest. Every warrior who arrived in Valhalla was, from Odin's perspective, another soldier in an evocation army he had been building for uncounted centuries against a battle he could not prevent, but well intended to meet with the best possible force at his side. The feasting, the mead, the community of the hall, these were real gifts to the warriors who received them, but they were also, always, preparation. Nothing Odin did was without purpose, and even his most generous-seeming acts had this quality of long strategy behind them. Across the 9 worlds themselves, Odin's presence was similarly purposeful. He traveled frequently in disguise, a grey-cloaked, wide-hatted wanderer who looked like an old man and moved through the world of humans without announcing himself. He would appear at crossroads, at feasts, in the halls of kings, asking questions and answering them, testing those he encountered for wisdom and courage and the qualities he valued, in exactly the way a general might scout the human world for useful material. Sometimes he helped the people he encountered, sometimes he did not. The outcomes seemed to depend less on the morality of those involved, and more on the calculations of a figure who was always working towards something larger and further away than any individual interaction. The 9 worlds themselves, connected by Yggdrasil's roots and branches, were the full scope of everything the Norse understood as existence. Asgard at the top, where the gods lived. Midgard, the middle world, where humans lived, literally the world we stand on. Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, Odin's perpetual and complex adversaries, from whom he had nonetheless acquired more knowledge, through trickery and negotiation and occasional violence, than from almost any other source. Valheim, the realm of cold and ice and primordial mist, from which the world had originally formed. Muspelheim, the realm of fire, from which the fire giants would one day march to end it. Alfheim, Svartalfheim, Vanaheim, Helheim, each carrying its own character and its own inhabitants and its own contribution to the vast, interconnected shape of a cosmology that understood the universe not as a flat series of distinct places, but as something more like a living tree, everything rooted in the same deep soil, everything connected to everything else by the same branching structure overhead. Odin moved through all of it, not because he ruled all of it, though in a sense he did, but because every part of it had something he had not yet fully understood, and the not yet understanding was, for him, genuinely uncomfortable in a way that only more knowledge could relieve. That truth was Ragnarok. But before we arrive there is one more story that belongs between the sacrifices and the ending, because it is the one that showed Odin most clearly that the fate he feared could not be negotiated away, no matter how much he knew or how carefully he prepared. His son Balder began to have dreams. Balder was, by most accounts in the old sources, the most beloved of all the gods, radiant and good, in a way that made even his father's complicated figure seem darker by contrast. He was not cunning or difficult. He was simply, genuinely, well-loved by gods and humans alike, and his dreams were therefore alarming in a specific way that might not have applied to anyone else. Balder dreamed of his own death, repeatedly, vividly, with the quality that Norse tradition attached to prophetic dreams, something more than imagination, something that carried the weight of what was actually going to happen, rather than the lightness of what might. Odin, when he heard of his son's dreams, did what Odin always did when faced with knowledge he did not yet possess. He went to find more. He rode Sleipnir to the underworld, to the realm of Hel, where a prophetess lay buried, and he woke her from death and compelled her to speak, asking question after question about what was coming, what would kill his son, who would mourn him, who would avenge him. She answered, though with the irritation of someone disturbed from well-earned rest, and what she told him was clear enough. Balder would die, and the death of Balder would be the first real break in the structure of the world, the beginning of the sequence of events that would end at Ragnarok. Frigg, Odin's wife, and Balder's mother, tried to prevent it in the way a mother might, making every object in existence swear not to harm her son. She asked the fire and the water, the stones and the metals, the plants and the diseases and the animals, every creature and substance she could reach, and every one of them swore, and for a while it seemed as though the cleverness of a mother's love might actually outmaneuver fate itself. The gods made a game of it, throwing things at Balder and watching them bounce harmlessly away, an entertainment built on the confidence that nothing could reach him now. Loki, the great trickster of the Norse pantheon, found the one thing Frigg had missed: mistletoe, which she had judged too young and too small and too harmless to bother asking. Loki fashioned it into a dart, guided the hand of Balder's blind brother Hoder to throw it, and Balder fell. The grief that followed was described in the old sources as the deepest mourning the Norse mythological world had ever known. Gods and giants, and even the stones weeping, the world dimming with the loss of the one figure who had been, genuinely, and without complication, good. Odin knew, watching his son's funeral, that the sequence had now begun. The chain of events he had foreseen, and prepared for, and been unable to prevent, had started moving. Loki would be bound for his role in it. The long winter of Fimbulwinter would follow, 3 years without summer, and then the final battle. And Odin kept going. He kept sitting on Hlidskjalf, kept sending his ravens out each morning and watching them return each evening, kept building and thinking and preparing and gathering, right up until the morning when the preparation gave way to what it had always been preparation for. That truth was Ragnarok. The Norse conception of the end of the world is unlike almost any other in world mythology, and understanding it properly requires understanding one thing first. This was not an ending that happened suddenly or without warning. The Norse gods knew it was coming. They had known for a very long time. The Norns, those great weavers of fate at Yggdrasil's roots, had woven the thread of Ragnarok into the fabric of existence from near the beginning, and no amount of power or wisdom or sacrifice could pull that thread back out. A great prophetess, a Volva, had spoken the entire shape of what was coming to Odin himself, and the picture she gave him was precise and detailed and final. On the day of Ragnarok, the wolf Fenrir would break the chains that held him. The world serpent Jormungandr would rise from the sea. Loki, the trickster, would sail a ship made of the nails of the dead against the shores of Asgard. The fire giant Surt would march from Muspelheim with a burning sword, and Odin himself would march out to meet Fenrir, knowing already that Fenrir would swallow him whole. Thor would kill Jormungandr and take 9 steps before falling from the serpent's venom. Freyr would die for want of the sword he had traded away. The world would burn and sink into the sea. Odin knew all of this. He had known it for an immeasurable span of time, and his response to knowing it is the thing that, more than any individual sacrifice or any specific story, defines who he actually was. He spent his entire existence preparing for Ragnarok, not because he believed preparation could prevent it, but because the thought of walking into the final battle with less wisdom, less knowledge, less understanding than he could possibly carry was, to him, genuinely unbearable. Every sacrifice he made, the eye, the 9 days on Yggdrasil, 100 smaller encounters with danger and difficulty that the old sources describe throughout his long history, was driven by this. He could not undo fate. He could not save himself or his fellow gods from what was coming, but he could make sure that he arrived at that ending, knowing as much as it was possible for any being to know, having understood as deeply as any being had ever understood, having prepared the ground as well as it could be prepared for whatever came after. Because there was a shape to what came after, and the old sources, when they speak of it, give it a quality that is less like destruction and more like exhaustion, finally giving way to rest. After the fire and the flood and the silence, the earth would rise again from the sea, clean and new and green, and some few beings would survive to walk it. 2 humans, hidden inside the World Tree itself, sheltered through the catastrophe, would emerge to begin the world again. Some of the younger gods would find their way back to each other on a plane called Idavol. The golden game pieces that the old gods had played with in the earliest days would be found again, in the grass, left there from before the first disaster, and the new world would begin with those pieces in hand, knowing the shape of what had come before. This is the thing about Ragnarok that makes it so unlike any simple story of destruction. It was not nihilism. The Norse understanding of the end of the world was, at its heart, cyclical rather than terminal, an ending so complete that what came after had the quality of genuine newness rather than mere continuation, but still, nonetheless, an after. Odin knew this, or believed it, or hoped it, and the knowledge did not comfort him, exactly, but it gave his sacrifices a direction. He was not simply collecting wisdom for its own sake. He was building something that might outlast him, might inform whatever came next, might mean that the new world began with at least some of what the old world had learned at such cost. Whether that reasoning was correct, the old stories do not say. They give us the picture and leave the judgment to whoever is listening. On the morning of Ragnarok, by every account of it that survives, Odin went to ask Mimir's severed head, which he had preserved and kept with him, for counsel. Mimir, remember, had died in an ancient war between the gods, and Odin, unable to fully accept the loss of that wellspring of wisdom, had preserved what remained, and kept the conversation going in the only way still available to him. He asked, and Mimir answered, and what exactly passed between them in that final morning, the old sources do not fully reveal. Only that Odin rode out afterward to meet what was coming, only that he fought Fenrir, the great wolf, and that the wolf swallowed him, only that his son Vidar, who had prepared for exactly this moment, avenged him. And then the world burned, and then the world was new. If you are lying there tonight, thinking about what drives a person to keep learning, keep paying, keep walking toward a fate they already know is coming, there is something in that ancient story that might be worth holding for a moment. The Norse did not believe their gods were perfect or invincible. They believed their gods were wise, in the specific sense of having paid real prices for real understanding, and brave, in the specific sense of knowing exactly what was coming and going to meet it anyway. Odin was not good in any simple sense, but he was, by the measure his own mythology applied to him, something that perhaps takes more. He was honest about what the world cost, and he paid what it asked. Let that settle now, as the branches of Yggdrasil settle in the cold wind, connecting all the worlds in the dark. The ravens have come home for the night, memory and thought both folded quiet. Rest well. This has been Sleep and Seek. Thank you for spending this quiet stretch of time with us. Good night.